They found the medical bag in the foundation of a North End building during the renovation of 2008. Inside, rusted surgical tools, bottles of morphine crystallized with age, and a leather journal with water-damaged pages. The last entry, dated March 1947, read only this: "Forgive me, Father, for I have saved them all." The police traced the bag to a name that had been erased from church records 60 years prior. A choirboy, a healer, a ghost who walked between the pews and the blood-soaked backrooms of Boston's underworld. They called him the Angel. The mob called him Insurance. The church called him nothing at all. This is his confession. Before we continue the story of the choirboy who traded his soul for silence, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me where you're listening from. Which city? Which state? I'm curious to know who's brave enough to follow this story to the end. Boston, 1941. Winter came early that year, and it came mean. The kind of cold that made your breath hang in the air like a ghost refusing to leave. In the narrow streets of the North End, where Italian and Irish territories pressed against each other like knife blades, the snow fell dirty from the start. It landed grey on the cobblestones, mixing with coal dust and the smell of fish from the harbour. Thomas Kavanagh was 17 that winter, and he still believed in purity. He sang soprano in the choir at St. Anthony's, his voice threading through the incense-thick air every Sunday morning. His mother said it was the voice of an angel, and she said it with tears in her eyes because she knew what that voice cost her. His father had been a doctor, one of the few Irish Catholics allowed to practice in the better parts of the city, until the drink took him the way it took so many men who saw too much suffering and couldn't wash it away. Thomas inherited his father's hands, steady, precise. By 17, he could stitch a wound cleaner than most surgeons, set a bone straight enough to heal without a limp. He'd learned by watching, then by doing. In the years before his father's hands started shaking too badly to hold a scalpel. The church basement where the choir practiced smelled of damp stone and candle wax. Father Donovan, a thick-necked man with a face like worn leather, led them through the Latin hymns with the patience of someone who understood that beauty took time. Thomas stood in the back row, his voice rising above the others, pure and clear. The other boys envied him. The older men in the congregation looked at him and saw their own youth, before the city bent them into shapes they never intended to become. After practice, Thomas would walk home through streets where everyone knew everyone's name, everyone's business, everyone's debts. His mother worked as a seamstress, her fingers bent from years of needlework, her eyes dim from straining over fabric in poor light. They lived in 3 rooms above a bakery, and the smell of bread rising was the smell of home, even when there wasn't enough money to buy any. It was a Thursday when everything changed. Thomas remembered because Thursday was collection day in the neighborhood, when men in long coats walked from business to business, and shopkeepers handed over envelopes without meeting anyone's eyes. He was cutting through the alley behind Giordano's bakery, taking the shortcut home, when he heard the sound. Not a scream. Worse. A wet, struggling breath, the kind of sound a punctured lung makes when it's trying to pull air through blood. The man was propped against the brick wall, his shirt front black with it. Not old, maybe 30, with dark hair slicked back and a face going the color of wet newspaper. His eyes found Thomas, and in them was something Thomas had seen before, in his father's patience when the pain got biblical. Desperation. The kind that makes men believe in God again. Please. The word came out pink. Please, kid. Thomas should have run. That's what every lesson his mother ever taught him said to do. You don't see, you don't hear, you don't know. That's how you survive in a neighborhood where the wrong word gets you hurt and the right silence keeps you breathing. But his father's hands were his hands, and they moved before his mind caught up. He knelt in the slush, in the blood that was already freezing at the edges. The man had been stabbed once between the ribs. Clean entry, probably a stiletto or a narrow blade, the kind of knife that slides in quiet and kills slow. Thomas pressed his hands to the wound, felt the warm pulse of blood against his palms. Don't talk, Thomas said. You talk, you die faster. The man's coat was expensive, camel hair, the kind Thomas had only seen on men who walked out of the better restaurants downtown. His shoes were shined to a mirror finish, barely scuffed. His hands, when Thomas saw them, wore gold rings on 3 fingers. Thomas knew what that meant. Everyone in the North End knew what that meant. He tore the man's shirt open, buttons scattering into the dirty snow. The wound was bad, but not immediately fatal if he could stop the bleeding. His father's medical bag was at home, but he had his pocket knife, clean because he'd been carving a piece of wood in church when he should have been listening to the sermon. He had his undershirt, which he stripped off despite the cold, and he had his hands. The man watched him work with dimming eyes. Thomas packed the wound tight, used strips of his undershirt to bind it. Pressure points his father taught him on cadavers in the hospital morgue. His fingers were numb from the cold, but they didn't shake. They never shook. "You're going to make it," Thomas said, and he didn't know if he was lying. Footsteps echoed in the alley. Heavy boots, more than one pair. Thomas looked up to see 3 men in dark overcoats, their faces hard and their eyes harder. The one in front, older, with silver in his hair and a scar running from his temple to his jaw, looked at Thomas, then at the wounded man, then back at Thomas. "What's your name, kid?" Thomas's mouth was dry. "Thomas Kavanagh." "You know who this is?" The man gestured to the wounded man. "No, sir. That's my nephew, Paulie Santoro. You just saved his life." It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded anyway. The man with the scar studied him with eyes that had seen everything twice and believed nothing the first time. "How old are you?" 17. "You always play doctor in alleys?" "My father was a doctor." "Was?" "Yes, sir." The man reached into his coat, and Thomas's heart seized. But what came out was a wallet, thick with bills. He pulled out 5 20s, more money than Thomas's mother made in 2 months, and held them out. Thomas didn't take them. "I don't want money." The man's eyebrows rose. "No? I just want to go home." Something changed in the man's face. Not softness exactly, more like recognition, the way you recognize a rare thing when you see it. He put the money back, then reached into his other pocket and pulled out a card. Plain white with just a phone number printed in black ink. "My name is Vincent Santoro. You need anything at all, you call that number. Understand?" Thomas took the card because refusing felt more dangerous than accepting. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind of card that meant something in certain circles. "Now go home," Vincent said, "and forget you saw this." Thomas went. Behind him, he heard them lifting Paulie, heard the scuff of shoes on wet stone. He walked fast, his coat pulled tight over his bare chest, the cold biting into his skin. When he reached the street, he looked back once. The alley was empty, just blood in the snow, already turning brown, already being covered by fresh flakes falling from the black sky. He threw the card into a gutter drain and went home. But the card didn't matter. Vincent Santoro had seen his face. And in the North End, once you're seen, you're never invisible again. 3 days passed before they came for him. Thomas spent those days trying to convince himself it was over. He sang in the choir. He helped his mother with the mending in the evenings, threading needles when her eyes got too tired. He attended his classes at the public school where the nuns taught with rulers in their hands and disappointment in their voices. He prayed, though he wasn't sure what he was praying for anymore. On Sunday, after Mass, Father Donovan pulled him aside in the vestibule. The priest's face was troubled, creased with lines that hadn't been there the week before. "Thomas," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the congregation filing out into the cold morning. "Have you had any unusual visitors lately?" Thomas's stomach dropped. "No, Father." Father Donovan studied him the way he studied everyone who came to confession, looking for the truth beneath the words. If anyone approaches you with questions or requests that make you uncomfortable, you come to me immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes, Father." But they both knew it was a lie. In the North End, the church could offer sanctuary, but it couldn't offer protection, not from men like Vincent Santoro. The knock came on Tuesday evening, just as Thomas and his mother were finishing a dinner of boiled potatoes and the end of a loaf of bread. His mother stiffened at the sound, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. In their neighborhood, unexpected knocks after dark were never good news. Thomas opened the door to find a young man on the landing barely older than himself. wearing a suit that looked like it cost more than their monthly rent. His hair was pomaded back, and he had the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing nobody would dare touch you. Thomas Kavanagh? Yes. Mr. Santoro would like to see you. I'm eating dinner. The young man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Mr. Santoro would like to see you now. Thomas looked back at his mother. Her face had gone white, her lips pressed into a thin line. She knew. Everyone in the North End knew what it meant when Vincent Santoro wanted to see you. I'll be back soon, Thomas said. His mother nodded, but her hands were shaking as she set down her fork. The car was a Packard, black and gleaming, even in the dim light of the street lamps. The young man opened the back door and Thomas climbed in, the leather seats cold beneath him. They drove in silence through streets Thomas knew by heart, past the church, past the closed shops, past the corner where old men stood even in winter, smoking and watching everything. They stopped in front of a social club on Hanover Street. The windows were steamed, and through them Thomas could see shapes moving. Men gathered around tables, the blue haze of cigarette smoke. The sign above the door read, Colombo Athletic Association, though Thomas doubted anyone inside had done anything athletic in years. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of espresso and anisette. Men looked up as Thomas entered, their conversations pausing, their eyes measuring him. He felt like a specimen under glass, a strange creature that didn't belong in this world of sharp suits and sharper glances. Vincent Santoro sat at a table in the back, a cup of coffee in front of him and a newspaper folded to the racing forms. Paulie sat next to him, alive and pale but breathing. When Paulie saw Thomas, something crossed his face. Gratitude, maybe. Or guilt. Sit, Vincent said, gesturing to an empty chair. Thomas sat. A man brought him an espresso without asking, set it down in a tiny cup that looked like a toy. Thomas didn't drink it. You threw away my card, Vincent said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. I didn't need it. No? Vincent leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with those eyes that missed nothing. Your mother works herself blind sewing other people's dresses. You wear shoes with holes in the soles. Your father drank himself to death because he couldn't stand what he saw every day. You're 17 years old, and you've got the hands of a surgeon and the education of a street kid. You sure you don't need anything? Thomas said nothing. The truth was its own kind of trap. My nephew is alive because of you, Vincent continued. That means something. In my world, debts matter. They're the only thing that matters. And right now, I owe you a debt I can't repay with money, because you won't take it. So I'm going to offer you something else. I don't want anything from you. Vincent smiled, but it was a sad smile, the kind worn by men who'd seen too many people refuse them, only to come crawling back later. You say that now, but winter's long, kid, and it's going to get longer. Your mother's cough is getting worse. I hear it in church. You hear it too, don't you? That wet sound she tries to hide. Thomas's hands clenched under the table. There's a doctor on Beacon Hill, Vincent said. Best in the city. He owes me favors. One word from me and your mother gets treatment, real treatment, the kind that costs more than you'll make in 10 years. What do you want from me? Nothing you haven't already done. Sometimes my people get hurt. Sometimes they can't go to a hospital because hospitals ask questions and questions bring police. I want you to help them. That's all. You do what you did for Paulie. You patch them up. You keep them breathing, and your mother gets to keep breathing too. The espresso in front of Thomas had stopped steaming. Across the room, a radio played soft Italian music, mandolins and a woman's voice singing about lost love. Everyone in the club was pretending not to listen, but Thomas could feel their attention like heat on his skin. I'm not a doctor, Thomas said. Your father was, that's close enough. What if someone dies? Then they die. That was always going to happen, but maybe they don't. Maybe you give them a chance they wouldn't have had otherwise. Isn't that what your God wants, mercy? Thomas looked at Paulie, who was looking anywhere but at him. The bandage on Paulie's side was clean, professional. Someone had redone Thomas's field dressing, but the work underneath had held. Paulie was alive because Thomas had knelt in an alley and refused to walk away. I need to think about it, Thomas said. Vincent nodded. You do that, but don't think too long. Winter's here and your mother's cough is getting worse every day." The same young man drove Thomas home in silence. When they pulled up in front of the bakery, the young man reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick with bills. "For your time," he said. Thomas didn't take it at first, but then he thought about his mother's cough, about the way she winced when she thought he wasn't looking, about the cold that seeped through the cracks in their walls. He thought about his father, who'd tried to help people and drowned in whiskey because helping wasn't enough. He took the envelope. Upstairs, his mother was waiting, her rosary beads moving through her fingers like worry made solid. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said what they both knew: that he'd just stepped onto a path with no way back. That the choice had already been made the moment he knelt in that alley. That mercy, in the end, was just another name for compromise. Thomas told himself it would be once, just one time, one man, one wound, one night, and then he'd be done. The call came on a Friday, not to his house. Vincent was smarter than that. It came to the payphone on the corner near the church, and the old woman who ran the newsstand came knocking on Thomas's door with a message written on the back of a betting slip. "Midnight, back door of the club. Bring your father's bag." He'd kept the medical bag hidden under his bed, leather worn soft from his father's hands, filled with the tools of healing that had become tools of survival. He checked the contents in the dim light of his room. Scalpels, forceps, sutures, bottles of iodine and alcohol, morphine his father had kept for the patients who screamed too loud. Everything was there, waiting, like it knew this moment would come. His mother was asleep when he left, her breath rattling in her chest, a sound that cut deeper than any blade. He'd used some of Vincent's money to buy her medicine, but it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. The North End at midnight was a different world. The legitimate businesses were closed, shuttered behind steel gates and padlocked doors. But other doors were open, the kind without signs, where men came and went in silence and nobody asked questions. Thomas walked with his collar up and his head down, the medical bag heavy in his hand, his breath clouding the air. The back door of the club opened before he could knock. The same young man from before, whose name Thomas still didn't know, gestured him inside without a word. They went down a narrow hallway that smelled of garlic and cigarettes, past a kitchen where an old man was washing dishes, through a door hidden behind a curtain. The room beyond was small, barely more than a storage closet. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, harsh and unforgiving. A man lay on a table that looked like it had been stolen from someone's dining room, his shirt cut away, his breathing shallow and fast. Vincent stood against the wall, his face unreadable. Paulie was there too, and two other men Thomas didn't recognize. They all watched as Thomas approached the table. As he set down his bag and opened it with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. The man on the table had been shot. Twice, once in the shoulder, once in the side. The wounds were hours old. The bleeding mostly stopped, but the damage deep. Thomas could see the muscle torn, the bone chipped where the bullet had glanced off. The man's skin was grey, his pulse weak. "Can you fix him?" Vincent asked. Thomas examined the wounds, his mind cataloguing what he saw with the cold precision his father had taught him. The shoulder wound was clean enough. The bullet had passed through. But the side wound was worse. The bullet was still in there, lodged against something. A rib, maybe, or deeper. If it had hit the liver or the spleen, the man was already dead. He just didn't know it yet. "I need more light," Thomas said, "and boiled water, clean towels." They brought him what he asked for. Thomas scrubbed his hands in water so hot it burned, the way his father had shown him, counting to 30, scrubbing between each finger, under each nail. The morphine went in first, measured carefully, enough to dull the pain but not enough to stop the breathing. Then he cut. His father had taught him that surgery was about control. Control of the blade, control of the blood, control of your own fear. Thomas cut into the wound in the man's side, widening it, following the track of the bullet through damaged tissue. His fingers, slick with blood, found the metal buried deep. He worked it free with forceps, millimeter by millimeter, feeling for the resistance that meant he was pulling against something vital. The bullet came out in pieces, fragmented, copper jacket and lead core separated by impact. Thomas dropped them into a bowl with a sound like coins falling. Then came the real work. finding the bleeders, tying them off, stitching the muscle layer by layer, closing the skin with sutures so fine they were almost invisible. He worked for 2 hours. Nobody spoke, nobody left. They watched him work with the same intensity they'd watch a card game where lives were the stakes, which Thomas supposed was exactly what this was. When he was done, the man was still breathing, still grey, still weak, but breathing. Thomas bandaged the wounds with hands that ached from the tension, then stepped back and looked at what he'd done. "He needs real medical care," Thomas said. "A hospital, antibiotics. If infection sets in, he'll get what he needs," Vincent said. "Will he live?" "I don't know. Maybe, if he's lucky." Vincent nodded slowly, then reached into his pocket and pulled out another envelope thicker than the last. "For your trouble." Thomas looked at the envelope, at the blood on his hands, at the man on the table whose name he didn't know and didn't want to know. He thought about his mother's cough, about the doctor on Beacon Hill, about the price of mercy in a world where mercy was just another commodity to be bought and sold. He took the envelope. "One more thing," Vincent said as Thomas was packing up his bag. "The man who shot him. We found him this morning. He's not going to be a problem anymore." Thomas didn't ask what that meant. He didn't want to know. Outside, the night air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Thomas walked home through empty streets, past the church where he sang on Sundays, past the corner where old women lit candles for the dead. His hands still smelled like blood under the iodine, a smell that wouldn't wash away no matter how hard he scrubbed. He told himself it was just once, but he knew deep in his bones that once was never enough, that he'd crossed a line drawn in blood, and there was no crossing back. In the morning, his mother woke feeling better than she had in months. Thomas had left money on the kitchen table while she slept, enough for the good medicine, enough for a real doctor's visit. She cried when she saw it, cried and held him close and thanked God for the blessing. Thomas said nothing. He just held her and felt the weight of what he'd done settling into his shoulders, heavy as stone, heavy as sin, heavy as the silence he would carry for the rest of his life. They called for him again the next week, and the week after that. And soon it wasn't weeks but days, and then it wasn't days but whenever the phone rang or the knock came at the door. Thomas developed a routine. He kept his father's medical bag packed and ready, hidden in the back of his closet behind his Sunday clothes. He learned which calls were urgent and which could wait. He learned to walk through the North End streets at odd hours without drawing attention, learned which alleys were safe and which belonged to other crews, other territories, other versions of the same bloody business. His schoolwork suffered. The nuns sent notes home about his absences, his falling grades, his tendency to fall asleep during lessons. His mother worried, but he told her he was working nights at the docks, loading trucks, honest work for honest money. She wanted to believe him. She needed to believe him. So she did. The choir was different. In the choir, for 1 hour every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Thomas could still be the person he'd been before. His voice still rose pure and clear through the incense-thick air. Father Donovan still nodded approval when Thomas held a difficult note. The other boys still envied him, still watched him with a mixture of admiration and resentment. But Thomas could feel the change inside himself. It was like rust creeping through metal, invisible at first but spreading, weakening. Every time he stitched a wound, every time he removed a bullet or set a bone, or pumped a stomach full of the bad liquor that blinded men in the Italian neighborhoods, he felt a little more of himself disappear. The men he treated never thanked him. That wasn't the way it worked. They'd lie on whatever surface Vincent's crew had provided, a table, a cot, once the back seat of a Cadillac, and they'd grit their teeth against the pain and they'd watch him with eyes that calculated his worth and his weakness in equal measure. When he was done, they'd button their shirts over the bandages and walk out like nothing had happened, like they hadn't been bleeding out minutes before, like Thomas was just another tool they'd used and discarded. Only Vincent treated him differently. Vincent, who seemed to be everywhere in the North End, who walked into churches and restaurants and union halls like he owned them, which in a sense he did. Vincent always paid promptly, always in cash, always more than Thomas expected. And sometimes after a particularly difficult case, Vincent would sit with him and offer him coffee and ask him how he was holding up. "You've got a gift," Vincent said one night in February, after Thomas had saved a man who'd been gut-shot in a card game gone wrong. They were in the back office of the club, just the two of them. The sounds of laughter and music muffled by the closed door. Your father had it too, I'm told. That calmness, that focus. Most people, they see blood and they panic, but not you. You see blood and you get to work. Thomas said nothing. His hands still smelled like iodine and copper, no matter how many times he washed them. "How's your mother?" Vincent asked. "Better. The medicine's helping." "Good. That's good." Vincent lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating the scar on his face. "You know what I respect about you, Thomas. You don't pretend. These other kids, they get a taste of this life and they think they're tough. They swagger around, talk big, act like they're made. But you know what you're doing. You know what it costs. And you do it anyway because you have to. That's real strength. It doesn't feel like strength. It never does. Strength feels like doing what needs to be done, even when your guts are churning and your hands want to shake. And every part of you is screaming to stop. That's what separates men from boys in this world, Thomas. Not violence. Any idiot can throw a punch or pull a trigger. It's the ability to keep going when everything in you says quit. Thomas looked at Vincent. This man who ordered deaths as casually as other men ordered coffee, who ran the North End like a medieval fiefdom, who went to Mass every Sunday and kissed the ring of the same priest who heard Thomas's confessions. "Do you ever want to quit?" Vincent smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Every day. But quitting's not an option for men like us. We made our choices. Now we live with them." "I didn't choose this." "Sure you did. You chose it the moment you knelt in that alley and helped Paulie. You chose it again when you took my money. We all make our choices, Thomas. Some of us just make them younger than others." Later that night, walking home through streets slick with freezing rain, Thomas thought about choice, about the moment in the alley when he could have walked away, about every moment since when he could have said no, could have refused the money, could have told Vincent to find someone else. But his mother's cough had gotten better. The medicine worked. She was gaining weight, sleeping through the night without gasping awake. She smiled more. She hummed while she sewed. And all of that, every bit of her returning health, was paid for in blood that wasn't hers. That was the trap, Thomas realized. Not the money itself, but what the money bought. Hope, relief, a reprieve from suffering. How do you say no to that? How do you watch someone you love struggle and suffer when you have the power to help them? His father had faced the same question, Thomas thought. Every patient who couldn't pay, every immigrant who came bleeding and desperate, every child with fever and parents with empty pockets. His father had tried to help them all, had given away his skills and his time and eventually his health because he couldn't bear to turn anyone away. And the weight of all that helping, all that mercy, had crushed him until the only relief he could find was at the bottom of a bottle. Thomas was walking the same path. He knew it, and he couldn't stop himself any more than his father had been able to. Spring came reluctantly to Boston that year, the snow melting in fits and starts, revealing all the garbage and grime that winter had hidden. The streets ran with filthy water, and the air smelled of thaw and sewage and the coming warmth. In the North End, men shed their heavy coats and moved more freely, and with that freedom came violence. Thomas lost track of how many men he treated in those months. They blurred together in his memory, knife wounds and bullet holes, broken bones and crushed ribs, faces beaten to raw meat, fingers broken one by one to extract confessions or debts. He stitched and set and splinted and dosed morphine, and he stopped asking questions because the answers were always the same. Someone had disrespected someone. Someone had cheated someone. Someone had tried to move product on someone else's territory. In May, Vincent asked him to make a house call. The address was in the West End, in one of the nicer buildings where doctors and lawyers lived, where the hallways smelled of furniture polish and fresh flowers. Thomas climbed 3 flights of stairs with his medical bag in hand, his footsteps muffled by thick carpet. A woman answered the door before he could knock, middle-aged and pretty in the way of women who'd learned to hide their worry behind makeup and pressed dresses. "Are you the doctor?" she asked, and there was something desperate in her voice that made Thomas's chest tighten. "I'm Thomas. Mr. Santoro sent me." She led him inside, through rooms decorated with taste and money, past furniture that looked like it belonged in museums. A man sat in an armchair in the study, tall and distinguished, wearing a silk robe over pajamas. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, his lips split. But it was his hands that made Thomas's stomach drop. Both hands were wrapped in bloody towels, the blood soaking through, dripping onto the expensive rug beneath the chair. "They took his fingers," the woman said, and her voice broke on the last word. "The police came an hour ago. They gave us an envelope and told us to call Vincent Santoro's people. They said you'd come." Thomas knelt beside the man and carefully unwrapped the towels. 3 fingers were missing from the left hand, severed cleanly at the second knuckle. The cuts were precise, professional, made with a sharp blade and a steady hand. "Judge Harmon," the man said through his ruined lip. "That's my name, in case you were wondering." Thomas was wondering a lot of things, but the man's name was the least of them. "I need to see the fingers." The woman brought him an icebox. Inside, wrapped in ice and cloth, were the 3 missing fingers, pale and lifeless. Thomas looked at them, at Judge Harmon, at the expensive study with its leather-bound law books and polished mahogany desk. "Who did this?" Thomas asked. "Does it matter?" The judge's voice was flat, dead. "Can you help me or not?" Thomas could help. The wounds were clean enough. He could debride the tissue, close the stumps properly, dose enough morphine and antibiotics to prevent infection. What he couldn't do was make the man whole again. Couldn't give back what had been taken. Couldn't erase whatever the judge had done to earn this punishment. He worked carefully, precisely, cutting away the damaged tissue and stitching the wounds closed. The judge didn't make a sound, just sat there with his remaining fingers gripping the armrest hard enough to turn the knuckles white. The wife stood in the doorway, watching with eyes that had seen her world collapse in the span of an afternoon. When Thomas was done, he bandaged the hands and gave the judge instructions for care and pain management. Then he stood, packed his bag, and waited for the question he knew was coming. "Why did they only take 3? The judge asked. "Why not all of them?" "I don't know." "Bullshit. You work for Santoro. You know exactly why." Thomas looked at the judge, this man who'd probably sent dozens of people to prison, who'd sat on a bench and dispensed justice and lived in comfort while the people he sentenced rotted in cells. "Maybe they're giving you a chance to learn." "Learn what?" "That you can't use the law to hurt Vincent's business and expect to walk away unscathed. That being a judge doesn't make you untouchable. That 3 fingers is a warning, and if you don't listen, the rest will follow." The judge's face went even paler. "They told me I'd be protected. The people who asked me to target Santoro's operations, they said I'd have protection." "From the police who brought you that envelope? From the same people who called Vincent before they called an ambulance?" Thomas closed his bag with a snap. "You're not protected, Your Honor. You're owned. Everyone in this city is owned by someone. The only question is whether you know who your owner is." He left the judge sitting in his expensive chair in his expensive apartment, staring at his ruined hands and understanding, probably for the first time, what real power looked like, what real consequences felt like. Outside, Vincent was waiting in a car at the curb. He didn't ask Thomas how it went. He already knew. "That was a message," Vincent said as they drove back to the North End. "To him. To the people who thought they could use him against us. Sometimes you don't kill a man. You just remind him that you could." Thomas said nothing. He watched the city roll past the car window, the neighborhoods changing from rich to poor, from clean to dirty, from the illusion of safety to the reality of survival. Somewhere in this city, someone was planning the next move against Vincent's crew. Someone else was getting desperate enough to try something stupid. Someone else was bleeding in an alley, waiting for help that might not come. And Thomas would be there to help them, because that's what he did now. That's what he'd become. The angel of the North End, the mob's personal physician, the choirboy who'd traded his soul for his mother's health, one patient at a time, one wound at a time, one terrible choice at a time. Summer in Boston that year was brutal, the kind of heat that made the pavement shimmer and the stink of the harbor intensify, mixing with the smell of rotting garbage and human sweat. Men moved slowly in the heat, their tempers short, their violence lazy and brutal. Thomas treated more beatings in June and July than he had in all of spring. Men worked over with pipes and bats and fists, their faces unrecognizable, their bodies a map of rage and punishment. He turned 18 in August. His mother made him a cake with the last of her sugar rations, war shortages making even small celebrations a sacrifice. She sang to him while he blew out the candles, and for a moment he was just her son again, just a boy becoming a man, not the thing he'd become in the shadows of the North End. But the moment passed. It always did. That night the call came for the worst case yet. They took him to a warehouse on the waterfront, one of the dozens of anonymous buildings where legitimate business ended and Vincent's business began. Inside, past the rows of crates marked with false manifests and false promises, in a room that smelled of fish and diesel and fear, two men waited with a body. Not a body, a man. Barely. He was maybe 25, naked from the waist up, tied to a chair. His face was a ruin. His chest was carved with shallow cuts, dozens of them, precise and deliberate. His breathing was labored, wet with blood. When he saw Thomas, something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe. Or just the knowledge that the pain was about to stop one way or another. Vincent stood against the far wall, smoking a cigarette, watching. Next to him was a man Thomas didn't recognize, older, with the kind of face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the rain. Cold eyes, calculating. "This is Marco Benedetti," Vincent said, gesturing to the stranger. "He's from Providence. We're helping him with a problem." Thomas looked at the man in the chair, at the careful cuts designed to hurt but not kill, at the way his fingers had been broken one by one, then reset badly so they healed crooked. Professional work. The kind of torture that took time and knowledge and a complete absence of mercy. "What do you want me to do?" Thomas asked, though he already knew. "Keep him alive," Marco said. His voice was rough, abraded, like gravel scraping against concrete. "I'm not done asking questions yet." Thomas's hands tightened on his medical bag. "I'm not a torturer. No, you're a healer, that's why you're here. To heal him enough so I can continue my conversation." "That's not healing, that's what Vincent promised me," Marco interrupted. "You're going to make Vincent break his word. That would be unfortunate for everyone." Thomas looked at Vincent, who met his gaze without flinching. This was a test, Thomas realized. Not of his skill, but of his willingness. How far would he go? How much would he compromise? Where was the line he wouldn't cross? The problem was, he'd been crossing lines for months. What was one more? He approached the man in the chair. Up close, the damage was even worse. The cuts were infected, the flesh around them angry and red. The broken fingers were swelling, cutting off circulation. Without treatment, the man would lose his hands to necrosis. With treatment, he'd suffer through more interrogation, more pain, more slow dismantling of his body and mind. "I need supplies," Thomas said quietly. "Antibiotics, fresh bandages, splints." They brought him what he asked for. Thomas cleaned the cuts with shaking hands, applied salve, wrapped them in gauze. He reset the fingers as best he could, splinted them properly. He gave the man water when Marco nodded permission, held the cup to his ruined lips, and watched him drink with desperate gulps. "Thank you," the man whispered in Italian. "Please, kill me." Thomas couldn't respond, wouldn't respond. He finished his work in silence, then packed his bag and stepped back. "How long can you keep him going?" Marco asked. "With proper care, weeks, maybe months." Marco smiled. It was the worst thing Thomas had ever seen, that smile. "Good. I like to take my time." Outside, in the suffocating heat of the August night, Thomas vomited in the alley behind the warehouse. He heaved until there was nothing left, until his stomach was empty and his throat burned, until the only thing left was the sour taste of bile and shame. Vincent found him there, leaning against the brick wall, his medical bag at his feet. "You did what needed to be done," Vincent said. "I helped you torture a man." "No, you kept a man alive. What happens to him after that isn't your responsibility." "Bullshit." Thomas's voice was raw. "Everything that happens is my responsibility. Every minute he suffers because I patched him up is on me. Vincent lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his scarred face. You think you had a choice? You think if you'd refused, we'd have just let you walk away? You're in this now, Thomas. All the way in. The only question is whether you accept it or spend the rest of your life pretending you're something you're not. What am I? One of us. You've been one of us since the moment you knelt in that alley. The sooner you accept that, the easier it gets. But it didn't get easier. That was the lie Thomas told himself every night as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to his mother's steady breathing in the next room. That somehow, if he just accepted what he'd become, the weight would lift, the guilt would fade. He'd find a way to live with himself. He never did. The man in the warehouse lasted 3 weeks. Thomas was called back twice more to keep him alive, to treat the new injuries Marco inflicted with the patience of a craftsman perfecting his art. The third time, Thomas arrived to find Marco packing his bags, satisfied. The man in the chair was barely conscious, more absent than present, his mind broken by pain into something that couldn't remember its own name. "Good work," Marco said, shaking Vincent's hand. "Your boy here, he's talented. If you ever want to loan him out, I know people who'd pay well." Vincent just nodded. When Marco left, Vincent turned to Thomas. "Put him down." "What?" "The man in the chair, he's served his purpose. Make it quick, make it clean." Thomas stared at the syringe Vincent pressed into his hand. Morphine. Enough to stop a heart if administered all at once. Enough to let a broken man slip away into darkness without pain. "I can't," Thomas said. "You already did. Every time you kept him alive for more torture, you were part of killing him. This is just the final act. The mercy at the end of the suffering. Isn't that what you do? Show mercy." Thomas looked at the man in the chair, at what was left of him, at the ruin Marco had made of human flesh and human mind, at the mercy that wasn't mercy at all, just another word for ending what should have ended weeks ago. He administered the injection. The man's breathing slowed, then stopped. His eyes, already empty, became more so. Thomas watched him die, watched the last tension leave his destroyed body, and felt something inside himself die too. "Now you understand," Vincent said quietly. "Now you know what we all know. That mercy and murder are just different names for the same thing. That in this world the only real choice is how much suffering you're willing to cause on your way to the inevitable end." Thomas walked home through empty streets as dawn broke over the city. In a few hours he'd go to church. He'd stand in the choir and sing hymns about grace and redemption. He'd receive communion with hands that had just killed a man. He'd kneel and pray to a God who was either absent or complicit in everything that happened in the dark corners of the North End, and life would go on, because that's what life did. It went on indifferent to the cost, deaf to the screaming, blind to the blood. The war in Europe ended that September. V-Day brought celebrations to Boston's streets, parades and parties, and the kind of collective relief that only comes when a great weight lifts from a nation's shoulders. Men would be coming home. Mothers and wives and sweethearts would have their boys back. The world could begin to heal from the wounds it had inflicted on itself. In the North End, the war's end meant opportunity. Rationing would continue, but the black market would expand. Men returning from combat would need work, and Vincent's organization was always hiring. The docks would be busier, the warehouses fuller, the cash flowing faster through the illegal channels that had fed off wartime scarcity. The celebration in the streets was real, but underneath it, Thomas could feel the current of calculation, the sense that one era of profit was ending and another was beginning. He'd stopped going to choir practice. Father Donovan came to see him in October, found him in the bakery where he was supposed to be working a legitimate job that was really just cover for the other work, the real work. The priest looked older, his face more lined, his shoulders bent under the weight of all the confessions he'd heard and couldn't share. "You haven't sung in months," Father Donovan said. "I've been busy." "Too busy for God?" Thomas almost laughed. "God's not interested in me anymore, Father." "That's not true. God is always interested. It's we who turn away." They stood in the back room of the bakery, surrounded by sacks of flour and the smell of rising dough. Through the doorway, Thomas could see the bakers working, their hands white with flour. their faces red from the oven's heat. Honest work. The kind of work that left you tired but clean at the end of the day. "I can't come back to the choir," Thomas said. "Can't or won't. Does it matter?" Father Donovan studied him with eyes that had seen too many young men lose themselves to the streets, to the bottle, to the kind of darkness that the North End bred like bacteria in warm milk. "What happened to you, Thomas?" "I grew up." "That's not growing up, that's giving up." "Maybe they're the same thing." The priest was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle, sad. "I've known Vincent Santoro for 30 years. I've watched him build his empire on the broken backs of good people who thought they had no choice. I've buried the men who crossed him and absolved the men who served him. And the one thing I've learned is that there's always a choice, Thomas. Always. Even when it doesn't feel like it. My mother would have died without Vincent's help. Your mother would have survived. She's stronger than you know, stronger than you gave her credit for when you decided to sell yourself to save her." The words hit Thomas like a fist. He wanted to deny them, to argue, to defend the choice he'd made in that alley months ago. But he couldn't, because Father Donovan was right. He'd underestimated his mother's strength, overestimated the danger she was in, and used her illness as an excuse to do what some part of him had already wanted to do. Prove that he had value, that his father's hands could do more than shake over a glass of whiskey. "What do you want from me, Father?" "I want you to come to confession. Really confess. Not the small sins you've been telling me about, but the real ones. The ones that are eating you alive from the inside. And then what? You absolve me, and everything's fine. No. Then you decide whether you're going to keep being the person you've become, or whether you're going to fight to be the person you were meant to be. I can't make that decision for you. Neither can God. That's the terrible gift of free will, Thomas. We all have to choose our own damnation, or our own salvation." After Father Donovan left, Thomas stood in the back room of the bakery for a long time, listening to the sounds of honest work, breathing in the smell of bread. He thought about confession, about kneeling in the dark booth and speaking his sins aloud, about the relief that might come from unburdening himself. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. The dead would still be dead. The tortured would still be tortured. The money he'd earned and the medicine he'd bought and the life he'd saved, his mother's life, would still be paid for in blood. He didn't go to confession. He went back to work. By the spring of 1946, Thomas was 19 and hollow. He'd treated over 100 men by then. Stabbings, shootings, beatings, burnings. He'd extracted bullets and stitched wounds and set bones and pumped stomachs full of bad liquor or pills meant to look like suicide. He'd kept dying men alive through force of will and medical knowledge, and he'd eased suffering men into death with morphine and steady hands. He knew the organization's structure now, the hierarchy that Vincent ruled with quiet authority. Knew the enforcers and the collectors, the bookmakers and the loan sharks, the men who smuggled liquor and the men who smuggled people. Knew which cops were on the payroll and which judges had been bought or broken. Knew where the bodies were buried, literally in warehouses and shallow graves, and concrete foundations of buildings that would stand for decades. He was valuable, essential even. Vincent had told him as much, had increased his pay until Thomas was making more than any legitimate doctor in the city. He'd moved his mother to a better apartment, bought her new furniture, hired a woman to help with the cleaning and cooking. His mother thought he was working as a medical assistant at a private clinic. She thought God had answered her prayers. In a way, he had, just not the way she'd hoped. The calls came at all hours now. Thomas carried a pager, one of the new devices that let Vincent's people reach him wherever he was. He'd stopped trying to maintain any kind of normal life, dropped out of school, stopped seeing the few friends he'd had, existed in a strange twilight world between the legitimate city above and the criminal city below, belonging fully to neither. He was treating a man with a broken jaw in the back room of a restaurant when the door opened and Vincent walked in, followed by a woman Thomas had never seen before. She was maybe 25, beautiful in the careful way of women who knew their looks were currency. Dark hair, dark eyes, a figure that even her modest dress couldn't hide. But it was her expression that caught Thomas's attention, a mix of fear and defiance that he recognized from his own mirror. "Thomas, this is Angela Rossini," Vincent said. "She's going to need your help." The woman sat when Vincent gestured to a chair, but her posture was rigid, defensive. Thomas finished bandaging the man with the broken jaw, gave him instructions and pain medicine, then waited for him to leave. When they were alone, Vincent closed the door. "Show him," Vincent said to Angela. She hesitated, then slowly unbuttoned her blouse. Underneath, her torso was a canvas of bruises, weeks old and healing badly. Dark purple fading to yellow-green, the distinctive shape of knuckles and fingers, the pattern of repeated violence. Thomas had seen enough beatings to recognize a systematic one. This wasn't rage. This was control. "Your husband?" he asked. She nodded. "Tell him the rest," Vincent said. "I want to leave him." Her voice was steady, stronger than Thomas expected. "But if I just run, he'll find me. He has friends, people who owe him. I need to disappear." Vincent said he could help, but she needs time to heal first, Vincent finished. "Can't disappear when you look like you've been worked over. Too memorable, too many questions." Thomas examined her carefully, professionally. 3 cracked ribs, by his estimation. Extensive soft tissue damage, possible internal injuries that would take time to reveal themselves. She flinched when he touched her side, a full-body recoil that spoke of months or years of conditioning. "You need to go to a hospital," Thomas said. "I can't. He'll find me there. He has cousins who work at City Hospital. They'll tell him." Thomas looked at Vincent, who just shrugged. "She's asking for help. I'm providing it. You're part of that help." So Thomas became Angela's physician. For 2 weeks he visited the apartment Vincent set her up in, treated her injuries, monitored her healing. She never complained, never asked for more than he offered, never pushed for conversation. But gradually, as the bruises faded and the ribs knitted, she began to talk. About her husband, who'd been charming until the wedding was over. About the first slap which he'd apologized for, swearing it would never happen again. About how the never-agains had turned into always, until she couldn't remember what it felt like to go a day without pain. "I should have left years ago," she said one evening, as Thomas checked her ribs. "Everyone says that, right? The women who stay. You should have left." Like it's that simple. Like love doesn't complicate everything. Like fear doesn't paralyze you. "It's not simple," Thomas said. "No, but I'm doing it now. That's what matters." She looked at him with those dark eyes that had seen too much. "Vincent says you're not like the others, that you still care about people." "Vincent says a lot of things. Is he wrong?" Thomas thought about the man in the warehouse, about the injection he'd given, about all the ways he'd compromised himself in service of Vincent's empire. Yeah, he's wrong. But he kept treating her anyway, kept visiting the apartment, kept monitoring her healing, kept listening to her stories of a life she was leaving behind. And somewhere in those visits, something shifted inside him. Not redemption, he was too far gone for that, but a reminder, a small stubborn ember of the person he'd been before, the boy who'd knelt in an alley because he couldn't watch someone suffer. When Angela was healed enough to travel, Vincent arranged her disappearance. A train to Chicago, new papers, a new name, money to start over. Thomas never knew if she made it. Never asked. In Vincent's world, the less you knew, the safer you were. But the night before she left, Angela kissed him. Just once, brief and desperate, in the doorway of the apartment that had been her refuge. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me as more than just another job." After she was gone, Thomas sat in the empty apartment for a long time, surrounded by the furniture Vincent had provided and the silence she'd left behind. He thought about Father Donovan's words, about choice and damnation and salvation, about whether he could still be saved or if that ship had sailed the moment he took Vincent's money. He didn't have an answer, but for the first time in months he wanted one. The truth was, Thomas had forgotten he could still want things. Somewhere between the alley and the apartment, between the first wound he'd stitched and the 100th, he'd stopped thinking about his own desires. He'd become a tool, a function, a necessary part of Vincent's machine, useful and used. Angela's departure left a hole, not because he'd loved her, he barely knew her, but because she'd reminded him that people could change their circumstances, could choose to leave, even when leaving seemed impossible, could risk everything for the chance at something better. He started thinking about leaving, not dramatically, not with a confrontation or a declaration, just slipping away, taking the money he'd saved, getting on a train, starting over somewhere Vincent's reach didn't extend. California, maybe, or down south, where the mob structures were different, where a young man with medical skills could disappear into a new life. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized how trapped he was. He knew too much, had seen too much, treated too many people who'd disappear if the wrong person started asking questions. In Vincent's world, there was no such thing as retirement. You stayed until you died, or you died trying to leave. He was pondering this grim calculus on a night in June when the call came that changed everything. Not Vincent. Poorly. "Tommy, you need to come. It's bad. It's..." The line crackled with static, with fear. "It's Vincent." Thomas's heart seized. He grabbed his bag and ran. They'd taken Vincent to the same apartment where Thomas had treated Angela, the place that was supposed to be safe, neutral. But there was no such thing as neutral in gang war, and what had started as a territorial dispute with a crew from Providence had escalated into attempted assassination. Vincent had been shot twice, once in the chest, once in the gut. The chest wound had been through and through, but the gut wound was bad, really bad. By the time Thomas arrived, Vincent was unconscious, his breathing shallow, his skin the color of old paper. The room was crowded with men Thomas recognized, Paulie, the enforcers, the trusted lieutenants. They watched him with faces that said everything. Fix this. Save him. If he dies, we're all dead. Thomas pushed them all back, cleared space, got to work. The bullet in Vincent's abdomen had perforated his bowel, maybe hit the liver. Impossible to tell without surgery, real surgery, in a real hospital with real equipment. But that wasn't an option. The police would be called. Questions would be asked. Vincent would die in custody if the wounds didn't kill him first. So Thomas did what he'd learned to do, improvise. He worked for hours, cleaned the wounds, extracted bullet fragments, tried to repair the internal damage with tools and techniques meant for far less severe injuries. He'd been trained by watching his father, by reading medical texts, by trial and error on men who didn't matter to anyone. But Vincent mattered, not just to Thomas, but to every man in that room, every business in the North End, every cop and judge and politician who'd been bought or intimidated into cooperation. If Vincent died, the empire collapsed. And when empires collapse, everyone in the rubble dies screaming. Thomas pumped Vincent full of antibiotics and morphine, stitched the wounds closed with sutures so fine they were almost invisible, and prayed to the God he'd stopped believing in. Then he sat back, his hands shaking with exhaustion, his shirt soaked with sweat and blood, and waited. Vincent didn't wake up. For 3 days he lingered in that liminal space between life and death, his breathing steady, but his consciousness gone. Thomas stayed with him, monitoring vitals, adjusting medication, treating the fever that spiked on the second day. The men came and went, bringing food Thomas didn't eat, offering words of encouragement that rang hollow. On the 4th day, Vincent opened his eyes. "Well," he rasped, his voice like gravel and rust, "you actually did it." Relief flooded through Thomas so powerfully it made him dizzy. "You're not out of the woods yet. But I'm alive, that's more than I expected." Vincent tried to sit up, gasped at the pain, fell back. "The men who did this?" "Handled," Paulie said from the corner. "They won't be a problem." Vincent nodded, satisfied, then turned those calculating eyes on Thomas. "You saved my life." "That's what I do." "No. What you do is patch people up. Keep them breathing long enough for me to use them. This was different. You could have let me die. Made it look like the wounds were too severe. Walked away clean, but you didn't." Thomas said nothing, because Vincent was right. He could have let him die. Should have, maybe. Let the empire collapse. Let the violence end. Let himself slip away in the chaos. But he hadn't. And he didn't know if that made him loyal or just too broken to let anyone die, even someone who deserved it. "You're family now," Vincent said. "Really family, not just an associate. You understand what that means?" Thomas understood. It meant there was no leaving, no train to California, no fresh start. He was bound now, not by money or fear, but by something deeper, by the debt that couldn't be repaid, the loyalty that couldn't be broken, by blood. "Yeah," Thomas said quietly. "I understand." Vincent smiled, and for the first time since Thomas had known him, there was genuine warmth in it. "Good. Because I'm going to need you for what comes next." What came next was war. Not official war, not the kind with declarations and treaties, but war nonetheless, fought in alleys and basements and the backs of moving cars. The Providence crew had overplayed their hand by trying to kill Vincent, and Vincent's response was methodical, brutal, and absolute. One by one, the men responsible were found and dealt with. Their operations were dismantled, their territories absorbed, their allies intimidated into switching sides. Thomas treated the wounded on both sides. His reputation had spread beyond the North End now. Men from other crews, desperate and bleeding, would find their way to wherever he was, seeking the angel who could keep them alive when hospitals weren't an option. He couldn't refuse them. To refuse was to take a side in conflicts he barely understood. So he treated them all, Vincent's men and their enemies, the Irish crews from South Boston and the Italian crews from the North End, anyone who came with the right introduction and enough money. His apartment became a surgery. His medical bag never left his side. His hands, which had once wanted to heal the world, now existed solely to prolong violence by keeping its practitioners breathing. The war ended the way all mob wars end, with a sit-down. Vincent, recovered enough to walk with only a slight limp, met with the leaders of the Providence crew in a restaurant closed to the public. Thomas wasn't there, but he heard about it later from Paulie, who'd stood guard outside while old men divided territory and counted their dead. 22 men, Paulie said, drinking coffee in the back room of the club where Thomas was treating a soldier who'd taken a beating that broke his ribs. That's how many died. 22 men, over what? A gambling territory? A liquor route? I don't even remember what started it anymore. Thomas didn't respond. 22 men. He'd treated 14 of them at various points in the conflict. 7 had died despite his efforts. 7 were walking around with scars he'd stitched closed, bullets he'd extracted, bones he'd set. And now it was over, settled by handshake and compromise and the understanding that everyone had lost enough. "Vincent wants to see you," Paulie continued. "Tonight, says it's important." Important turned out to be a promotion. Vincent had bought a building in the North End, 3 stories of brick and steel, and was converting the top floor into a proper medical clinic, examining rooms, surgical equipment, a recovery area with real hospital beds, legitimate looking on paper, a front business with actual medical supplies and legal documentation, but in reality, a place where Vincent's people could be treated without questions, without records, without risk. "You'll run it," Vincent said, showing Thomas through the empty rooms that smelled of fresh paint and possibility. "Hire a nurse or two, someone who knows how to keep their mouth shut. We'll set you up with a legitimate practice, treating neighborhood people during the day. Minor stuff, colds and sprains, nothing that'll draw attention. But at night, you take care of our people. You're giving me a clinic. I'm giving you legitimacy. Right now you're vulnerable. You work out of back rooms and basements, places where one raid would expose everything. This way, you've got cover. You're a doctor with a practice, helping the community. If anyone asks questions, you've got answers." Thomas walked through the clinic, his footsteps echoing on the bare floors. He imagined it full of equipment, full of people, full of the kind of work that looked noble from the outside. A respectable front for disreputable work. "What if I say no?" he asked. Vincent's expression hardened. "You won't, because you know what happens to people who say no to me. And because, whether you admit it or not, you like what you do. You like the work. You like being necessary. You like the feeling of holding someone's life in your hands and deciding whether they get to keep it." The words stung because they were partly true. Thomas did like the work. Not the violence that necessitated it, but the work itself, the focused intensity of surgery, the satisfaction of solving a problem no one else could solve, the knowledge that his skills made him irreplaceable. His father had chased that feeling into a bottle. Thomas had found it in blood. "When do I start?" he asked. Vincent smiled. "Tomorrow. I've got 3 men who need treatment. One's been waiting 2 days because I wanted you to see the clinic first. Consider it your opening ceremony." The clinic opened in August of 1946. Thomas hired a nurse named Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman in her 40s who'd worked in hospitals until her husband's gambling debts made her desperate enough to ignore where the money came from. She was efficient, quiet, and asked no questions. Perfect. During the day, they treated the neighborhood. Children with fevers, old men with bad lungs, women with the kinds of injuries they blamed on accidents, but everyone knew came from husbands or boyfriends. Thomas saw himself in them, in the lies they told to preserve dignity, in the way they accepted pain as the cost of survival. He treated them carefully, gently, charged them almost nothing. It helped him sleep at night, those legitimate patients. They were his penance, his tithe to the world he'd betrayed. At night, the other patients came, the ones with bullet wounds and knife cuts, with broken bones that needed setting without paperwork, with overdoses that needed reversing before the police were called. Thomas treated them all with the same detached professionalism, his hands steady, his conscience buried deep enough that it only screamed in his dreams. The clinic became a fixture of the North End. People knew what it really was, but nobody talked about it. That was the neighborhood's code. You see everything, you say nothing, you survive. Thomas became a respected figure, not quite trusted, but certainly valued. Mothers would nod to him on the street. Old men would tip their hats. Father Donovan would watch him from the steps of St. Anthony's, with eyes that held both sorrow and understanding. Thomas turned 20 in the clinic, treating a man who'd been beaten so badly his own mother wouldn't have recognized him. Mrs. Chen brought him a cupcake with a single candle, and they'd eaten it in silence between patients. 2 people who'd compromised themselves into survivability, if not quite respectability. That was the year Thomas stopped counting how many people he'd saved, stopped counting how many he'd failed to save, stopped keeping track of the line between healing and enabling, between medicine and murder. He'd become what Vincent always knew he would become. One of them. Completely, irrevocably, damningly. The angel of mercy, bought and paid for in blood. The end, when it came, wasn't dramatic. There was no raid, no betrayal, no moment of clarity that sparked redemption. Thomas simply woke up one morning in March of 1947 and realized he couldn't do it anymore. Not wouldn't, couldn't. The mechanism inside him that had allowed him to keep going, to keep treating and healing and enabling violence, had finally broken. He was 20 years old and felt 100. The breaking point was a boy, 15, maybe 16, brought into the clinic with a bullet wound in his shoulder. He'd been recruited by one of Vincent's crews, given a gun and a corner to defend, sent into the kind of violence that shaped boys into killers or corpses. The bullet had come from a rival crew's territory dispute. Meaningless violence over meaningless ground. Thomas extracted the bullet, cleaned the wound, stitched the boy's shoulder closed. The boy didn't cry, didn't complain, just stared at the ceiling with eyes that had already seen too much. When Thomas was done, the boy sat up and asked when he could get back to work. "You should rest," Thomas said. "Let it heal properly." "Can't rest, I got debts to pay. Vincent's covering my family's rent, but I gotta earn it back." "How much do you owe?" The boy named a figure that was obscene, impossible, designed to keep him working for Vincent until he was dead or useless. Thomas recognized the trap because he'd been in the same trap for 3 years, trading his skills for his mother's health, then trading them for legitimacy, then trading them because he didn't know how to do anything else. He looked at this boy who would never be a boy again, who would die young and violent, whose blood would be on Thomas's hands just as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger. And something inside him just stopped. "Get out," Thomas said. The boy blinked. "What?" "Get out of the city, get out of the life, take your family and run. Go somewhere Vincent doesn't have reach. Change your name. Start over." "I can't. My debts." "Fuck your debts. Fuck Vincent. Fuck all of it." Thomas pulled out his wallet, thick with cash from years of working for Vincent, and pressed it into the boy's hand. "This will get you started. It's enough for tickets. First month's rent somewhere far from here. Take it and go." The boy stared at the money like it might bite him. "Vincent will kill me. Vincent will kill you anyway. Might take months or years, but you'll end up dead in an alley or a basement or a shallow grave. This way you might live. Isn't that worth the risk?" The boy took the money. Thomas never knew if he ran or if Vincent found him first. Didn't matter. What mattered was that Thomas had finally done something that felt clean. That felt right. That wasn't just enabling the machine that ground people into meat. That night, Thomas wrote in his father's old journal, the one that had been in his medical bag all these years. He wrote about the alley, about Paulie, about Vincent's offer and his mother's cough. He wrote about every patient, every compromise, every small death of his conscience. He wrote about the man in the warehouse and the injection that had ended his suffering. He wrote about Angela and the boy with the shoulder wound and all the people he'd helped and hurt in equal measure. The last entry read, "Forgive me, Father, for I have saved them all." Then he packed his bag, not the medical bag, that stayed on the clinic's counter, a resignation without words. He packed clothes, documents, the money he'd saved that the boy hadn't taken. He wrote a letter to his mother, telling her he loved her, telling her the apartment and everything in it was paid for years in advance, telling her not to look for him. He left before dawn, when the north end was quiet and dark, and the only sound was his footsteps on cold pavement. He didn't look back at the clinic, at the church, at the streets he'd walked for 20 years. He just walked, carrying everything he owned in a single bag, heading towards South Station and the trains that would take him anywhere but here. He never made it. They found him 2 blocks from the train station, in an alley that could have been the same alley where it all started. 3 men. Not Vincent's men. By the cut of their suits and the coldness of their faces, Thomas guessed they were from Providence, or maybe New York, remnants of the war that had supposedly ended, here to settle old scores. "You're the angel," one of them said. Not a question. Thomas nodded. There was no point in denying it. "You kept our enemies alive. You saved Vincent Santoro when he should have died. That makes you responsible for every man Vincent killed after that." Thomas wanted to argue, to defend himself, to explain that he'd only been trying to survive, to help to do what his father's hands were meant to do. But the words died in his throat because he knew they were right. Every man Vincent had killed after Thomas saved him was, in some cosmic sense, Thomas's responsibility. Every act of violence Thomas had enabled by keeping violent men breathing carried his fingerprints as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger himself. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years keeping people alive, and now he was going to die for it. "Make it quick," Thomas said, and he was surprised by how calm his voice was, how ready. They did. A knife, fast and professional, into the space between his ribs that he knew so well from treating identical wounds. He felt the blade slide in, felt the breath leave his lungs in a wet rush, felt his legs give out. He collapsed in the dirty snow, the same kind of dirty snow that had been there the night he saved Paulie. As he died, Thomas thought about the choir, about the hymns he'd sung, about his voice rising pure and clear through incense-thick air, about the boy he'd been before the alley, before the choice, before the blood. He thought about his mother, who would wake to find him gone and never know what had become of him, about Father Donovan, who'd warned him and been ignored, about Angela, who'd escaped the trap Thomas had willingly walked into, about the boy with the shoulder wound, who might have made it out. Might have. His last thought, as the cold and darkness closed in, was this: at least he'd finally stopped saving them. At least he'd finally stopped. They found Thomas Kavanagh's body on March 15, 1947. The police report listed him as a victim of robbery, though his wallet was still in his pocket and his bag was untouched beside him. The medical examiner noted the precision of the fatal wound, the kind of cut that spoke of professional work, but nobody investigated further. In the North End, young men died in alleys all the time, and the smart play was to write the report and move on. His mother buried him in a grave she could barely afford, next to his father in the Catholic cemetery, where the Irish kept their dead separate from the Italians, even in death. Father Donovan performed the service. The church was full. Neighbors who'd known Thomas as a boy, patients he'd treated during the clinic's brief legitimate hours, people who'd loved him without knowing what he'd become. Vincent Santoro stood in the back, watching without expression, then left before the graveside service. He never spoke about Thomas again. The clinic closed within a week, The equipment sold off or redistributed, the building returned to legitimate business. Within a month, it was as if the angel had never existed. But the stories persisted. They always do. Old men in the North End still talk about the choirboy who became the mob's physician, who kept dying men alive through skill and desperation, who crossed every line except the final one. Some say he ran, that the body in the grave wasn't his, that he made it out and started over somewhere far from Boston's bloody streets. Some say Vincent had him killed for trying to leave. That loyalty has a price, and Thomas had failed to pay it. Some say he died random, a victim of the violence he'd enabled for 3 years, irony made manifest in a cold alley. The truth, as always, is more complicated, less satisfying. Thomas Kavanagh died the way he'd lived those final 3 years, caught between mercy and murder, healing and harm. The boy he'd been and the man circumstances had forced him to become. He'd tried to save people and ended up enabling their destruction. He'd tried to help his mother and lost his soul. He'd tried to be good in a world where goodness was just another commodity to be bought and sold. In the end, he was just a young man who made a choice in an alley, and that choice killed him as surely as the knife that ended his life years later. The medical bag turned up in 2008, hidden in the foundation of a building that had once been part of Vincent's empire. By then, everyone who'd known Thomas was dead. Vincent, Paulie, Mrs. Chen, Father Donovan, all of them gone to whatever judgment awaited people who'd lived in the grey spaces between right and wrong. The journal inside the bag was water-damaged, barely legible, but the last entry was clear enough. "Forgive me, Father, for I have saved them all. Confession and accusation. Pride and shame." The epitaph of a young man who discovered too late that in the world he'd entered, salvation and damnation were just two names for the same thing. That mercy, in the hands of the wrong people, becomes its own kind of violence. That keeping someone alive isn't always the same as saving them. That sometimes the most damning thing you can do is help. The police archived the bag, filed the journal as evidence in a case that would never be solved. The building was renovated, turned into expensive condos for young professionals who would never know that the foundation they stood on had once hidden the tools of a mob doctor who'd traded his soul for his mother's health, one wound at a time, one compromise at a time, one terrible choice at a time. And somewhere in the Catholic cemetery in Boston, a gravestone marks the resting place of Thomas Kavanagh, 1926-1947. Below his name, his mother had requested a single line be carved. He had the hands of a healer. She never knew how true that was, how terrible, how in the end those hands had saved no one at all, least of all himself.